The air inside the small red brick schoolhouse at Reims hung thick with smoke and exhaustion. It was 2:30 in the morning, and the war in Europe was ending, not with cheers or parades, but with the sound of typewriter keys striking paper. In what had once been a classroom, beneath the yellow glare of hanging lamps, the high command of the defeated Reich came face to face with the men who had destroyed it. This was the forward headquarters of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, the nerve center of the Western Allied campaign, and the place where Germany's unconditional surrender would become fact. Colonel General Alfred Jodl sat at a wooden table, his hands trembling slightly though his face remained composed. His uniform, rumpled and faded from long wear, carried no illusion of victory anymore. Across from him stood Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, the Chief of Staff to General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Smith's expression was calm, but cold. He had seen too much to feel triumph. On one side of the table, a Soviet representative, General Ivan Susloparov, watched silently, his eyes unreadable. Around them, officers, translators, and typists waited, pens ready, telephones buzzing faintly in the background. The world was waiting for signatures. The document in front of Jodl was short, no more than a few pages, but it ended the most destructive war in human history. The words were unambiguous. The German High Command hereby surrenders unconditionally all forces on land, at sea, and in the air to the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, and simultaneously to the Supreme High Command of the Red Army. Jodl took the pen. For a moment he hesitated not from defiance, but from fatigue so deep it had settled into his bones. Then he bent forward and wrote his name. The time was 2:41 in the morning. Bedell Smith signed next, then Susloparov, and finally the French representative, Major General François Sévez, who witnessed the act on behalf of France. At that moment, at least on paper, the war in Europe was over. But wars never end on paper. They end when the last order to stop fighting reaches the last man with a rifle, and when that man believes it. Between the moment of Jodl's signature and the moment silence truly fell across Europe, nearly 2 more days of killing remained. The surrender document contained one essential clause. Hostilities would cease at 11:01 on the night of May 8th, Central European time. The Allies needed that delay to send the news through every front, every headquarters, every outpost, and to confirm that the Red Army, advancing from the east, would receive the same message. Between the signing and the ceasefire lay roughly 44 hours that had to be filled with transmission, coordination, and command. At 3 o'clock that morning, teletypes in SHAEF's communications room began clicking out the surrender orders. British and American signal officers worked side by side, routing the message through every available channel: radio, cable, scrambler phone, and courier dispatch. The order's destination list was immense. Every remaining German army group, corps, and division still in contact with Allied or Soviet forces needed to receive it. The wording left no room for confusion. All offensive operations will cease. All units will remain in their current positions. All weapons will be made safe. Commanders are personally responsible for the maintenance of order and discipline until relieved by Allied forces. The Allied commanders knew that thousands of German soldiers were still fighting, some out of loyalty, others out of fear, and many simply because no one had told them otherwise. Entire army groups remained intact in the north and east, where the war had not yet reached them. If they were not informed, they would continue to fight, not for ideology, but because the machinery of command still functioned by habit. The signals room at Reims glowed with the light of vacuum tubes and the steady flicker of Morse lamps. Messages flowed outward in all directions. To Denmark, to Norway, to Austria, to Czechoslovakia, to the remnants of the once great Wehrmacht scattered across half of Europe. Most of those orders reached their targets within hours. But one of them, one that mattered more than anyone yet realized, did not. That message was addressed to Army Group Vistula, Heeresgruppe Weichsel, the German formation still holding positions against the Red Army in northern Germany, between the Baltic coast and the River Elbe. Under its command were tens of thousands of exhausted but armed men, including paratroopers of General Kurt's students' formations and remnants of the 12th and 21st Armies. Their lines faced Soviet tanks advancing through Mecklenburg and Brandenburg. They were desperate to surrender, but they would not act without explicit authority. Ceasefire order for Army Group Vistula was transmitted by Allied liaison officers through the provisional German government established under Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz at Flensburg. That was the only functioning chain of communication left to reach those units. But the Flensburg government's signal network was a wreck. Telephone exchanges had been bombed, telegraph cables cut, and field radio stations captured or destroyed. Couriers had to carry messages by truck along roads crowded with refugees, military convoys, and Soviet patrols. Somewhere between Reims and the Northern Front, that single crucial message vanished into the chaos. By dawn, on May 7th, German units along the Baltic were still receiving orders from the previous day to hold their ground against the Soviets, while negotiating separate surrender terms with the British. To them, talk of unconditional surrender was rumour. No one in their command had seen the Reims document. So they fought on, unaware that, legally, they no longer existed as a military force. For the Allied officers in Reims, this was a technical delay. For the men in the field, it meant another 48 hours of war. The Reims signal operators worked without rest, checking transmission logs, requesting confirmations, demanding acknowledgements from every node in the collapsing German network. Most replies came quickly, short-coded bursts, confirming receipt and compliance. But no acknowledgement arrived from the Northern Front. The message had gone out. No one could prove it had been received. Outside the headquarters, dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. The air smelled of spring rain and coal smoke. The soldiers on guard duty had no idea that, inside the building, history had changed overnight. To them, it was just another day of war. Trucks rolled past carrying dispatch riders, messengers, and wounded men. Somewhere down the road, artillery still rumbled in the distance, a reminder that paper declarations could not silence guns. Within hours, news of the surrender would flash across the Western world. In London, Paris, and New York, church bells would ring and crowds would gather. But across northern Germany, along the Elbe, and deep into the shattered lands beyond, no bells rang. The guns there still spoke. For 2 more days, soldiers and civilians would die for a war that, by every legal measure, was already finished. The world would remember May 8th as Victory in Europe Day. Yet for those caught between broken radios, ruined roads, and delayed couriers, victory arrived late. The message had been written, signed, and transmitted, but it had not yet been heard. Wars end with signatures, but men do not stop dying until messages move. In the first days of May, 1945, Germany existed only as geography. The Reich had ceased to function as a state, but it did not yet know how to die. Roads once reserved for troop convoys were now seas of humanity soldiers without commands, civilians fleeing armies, carts piled with children and furniture, wagons pulled by skeletal horses, staff cars with bullet holes in their doors. The war was finished in principle, but not yet in practice. Berlin had fallen. Soviet banners hung from the Reichstag, red against the grey ruin. Adolf Hitler was dead, a suicide by pistol and poison on April 30th, his body burned in a shallow crater while artillery still thundered nearby. Yet the news travelled unevenly, distorted and delayed. Entire formations in the field did not believe it. For 12 years they had been ordered to obey him. They could not imagine that his death meant the end of everything. The radio still spoke in his name. Somewhere in the north, near the Danish border, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, declared himself head of state under the title Reich President. His government operated from the small port town of Flensburg, using a handful of intact transmitters and field telephones. Around him clustered the last loyal remnants of the German High Command gaunt officers in faded uniforms who still used the formal greetings of a vanished empire. Their purpose was not victory. It was survival. Dönitz's plan was simple in outline, impossible in execution: surrender to the Western Allies, while continuing to resist the Soviet Union for as long as possible. He hoped to save as many German troops and civilians as he could by guiding them westward, out of Soviet reach. The Red Army's reputation for vengeance was already legend. Entire towns had been erased in its advance. If Dönitz could negotiate with the British and Americans, perhaps hundreds of thousands could escape captivity and death. It was a plan born of logic, not loyalty. But logic was useless in a landscape of collapse. The German armed forces were no longer a unified machine. Each fragment fought, retreated, or surrendered according to its own reality. Army Group Center, trapped in Bohemia and Moravia, faced encirclement. Army Group South fought in Austria, surrounded by advancing Allied divisions. Army Group Vistula, under General Kurt Student, was still holding the line along the Baltic coast against Soviet tank armies. No one could speak for all of them. Communication, the blood of war, had coagulated. The great signal networks that once carried Hitler's commands from the Wolf's Lair across Europe were silent. Relay stations lay in rubble. Telegraph cables were cut. Field radios were jammed or captured. Messages moved now by rumor and courier, on foot or by truck. Some commands travelled by word of mouth through terrified civilians. Officers issued orders written in pencil on scraps of paper, passed from one retreating unit to another. No one knew which instructions were valid. In that fog of disintegration, myth replaced message. Some soldiers believed that the Western Allies had accepted a separate truce. Others were told that the Führer lived, directing secret counterattacks from the mountains. Still others thought that surrender to the Soviets meant execution, and that their only hope was to fight west until they reached the British. The truth that Germany had already agreed to unconditional surrender would take days to penetrate those illusions. At Flensburg, Dönitz's cabinet debated what the surrender should look like. General Alfred Jodl, still moving between Flensburg and Allied headquarters, argued for a broad capitulation to all fronts. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, his face puffed and pale from exhaustion, insisted that any surrender must exclude the East to protect German civilians from the Red Army. Every hour of delay meant more lives lost. But Dönitz hesitated. He needed proof that the Western Allies would accept his government as legitimate. Until then, the fighting had to continue at least enough to keep order among the remnants of the Wehrmacht. The result was a paradox. The German state was preparing to surrender while still issuing orders to fight. Radio messages from Flensburg went out under the signature Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Armed Forces, urging continued resistance against Bolshevism. To the men in the field, that sounded like a command. To the Allies, it looked like defiance. In truth, it was confusion given form. On the front lines, the effect was tragic. Units on the Elbe River watched American troops across the water but dared not cross without explicit permission. Panzer crews, out of fuel, destroyed their tanks rather than surrender them to the Soviets. In villages of Mecklenburg and Pomerania, German officers forced civilians to evacuate at gunpoint, insisting that the British were only a few miles away. They were not. The situation grew more chaotic with every hour. Refugee columns clogged the roads so completely that military traffic could scarcely move. Allied bombers, unaware of who was friend or foe, struck convoys that still bore German markings. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded from battles that no longer had meaning. Even when word of Hitler's death arrived, many officers refused to believe it. If the Führer were dead, one colonel said to his adjutant, we would have been told officially. The adjutant said nothing. He had heard the truth from a captured BBC broadcast, but knew that speaking it aloud was treason. In that landscape of half-truth and silence, the machinery of war continued to grind. Divisions that no longer existed on paper were still firing artillery. Pilots with no fuel reserves still took off in Mi-109s to strafe Soviet columns. The German army was a ghost that did not know it was dead. By the time Colonel General Jodl left Flensburg for Reims on May 6th, the communications system under Dönitz was barely functioning. His radio staff operated out of a requisitioned schoolhouse with a single transmitter that could reach only parts of northern Germany. Messages for the eastern fronts had to be carried by courier, handed off across shattered bridges and shell-pocked roads. When SHAEF's surrender orders were drafted after Jodl's signing on May 7th, they would depend entirely on that same broken system to reach the field. That was the trap. The Allies believed that one order, once signed and transmitted, could halt the war. But the men still fighting did not live in the world of teletypes and secure cables. They lived in the noise between them, in a country where messages vanished into smoke and echo. It was within that noise, between Reims and the Baltic coast, that one message, the one that mattered most, went missing. And because of that, what should have ended on May 8th would not end until May 9th, when the last guns of the European war fired not in anger, but in ignorance. The surrender at Reims was supposed to end everything, but the transmission that carried that end to the last German soldiers failed to arrive when it mattered. What history calls a lost message was not truly lost. It was delayed, fragmented, and misrouted through a web of dying communications. The consequence was 2 more days of war, measured in artillery bursts and body counts instead of clock hours. After Colonel General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender, Allied signal officers at SHAEF began the most urgent communication relay of the entire war. The order to cease hostilities had to reach every remaining German commander through official channels, not rumor, not assumption, but documented command authority. The text was simple. All operations will cease at 11:01 on the night of May 8th, Central European Time. The message was written in English and German, authenticated by cipher, and sent through British, American, and German relay networks simultaneously. The first step was Allied transmission. Teletypes in Reims hammered out the message to field. Commands in Denmark, Norway, Austria, and northern Germany. A copy went to Admiral Karl Dönitz's government in Flensburg, which was still functioning as the last German command node. Dönitz and his staff were expected to forward the surrender order through their surviving Wehrmacht networks to every army group still in contact with the Allies or the Soviets. It was a system built on the assumption that a nation still existed to obey it. In reality, the system was shattered. The Flensburg government operated out of requisitioned buildings on the Baltic coast with barely enough fuel for its generators. Telephone lines had been cut by retreating troops or destroyed by artillery. Field transmitters were running on car batteries, scavenged from abandoned vehicles. Couriers rode in captured Allied jeeps or on bicycles, carrying sealed orders through territories where no one knew which army controlled the next village. Every step of the process was vulnerable to chance, and chance did what armies could not. On the afternoon of May 7th, the key surrender order, addressed to Army Group Vistula, left Reims with a British signals team attached to SHAEF's liaison section. Their route ran through Antwerp, Brussels, and then north to the coastal relay at Flensburg. From there, Dönitz's radio operators were supposed to forward the message to the remaining commanders of the 12th and 21st German armies, whose divisions were still fighting Soviet forces near the Baltic Sea. But the truck carrying the British team broke down outside Lüneburg. The roads were jammed with refugees and surrendering troops. Mechanics were unavailable, and Soviet aircraft were strafing anything that moved. By the time the vehicle reached Flensburg, it was well past midnight. At the same moment, the German radio station at Flensburg lost power. Allied engineers later determined that an overloaded generator had failed. It was not sabotage, only exhaustion. The technicians had been working without rest for 3 days, trying to keep the signal lines open to the northern front. When the generator failed, the transmission equipment went dark. Power was restored hours later, but by then, the communications window for the eastern commands had closed. Soviet jamming and weather interference over the Baltic rendered long-range radio transmission unreliable until the following morning. The Flensburg staff still attempted to send the message. Records from the U.S. National Archives show at least 3 incomplete radio bursts transmitted on the morning of May 8th. Each contained fragments of the surrender order, but not the full text. 2 were received by naval stations along the coast. The third, directed toward the 12th Army, never arrived at all. The signals were garbled beyond recognition. German operators in the field, hearing only broken code groups, assumed the transmission was Allied propaganda. Meanwhile, the 12th Army's field headquarters near Schwerin continued to issue defensive orders against the advancing Red Army. Soviet Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front had crossed the Oder and was pressing toward the Elbe, unaware that a ceasefire was imminent. In those last 2 days, the fighting grew even more savage as both sides sought to capture or escape territory before official surrender. Infantry regiments that should have been stacking rifles instead launched counterattacks. Soviet tanks burned villages still defended by German paratroopers. In one surviving report from the 13th Guards Rifle Division, dated May 8, 1945, Soviet officers describe heavy fire from German machine guns near the town of Wismar. The enemy continues organized resistance despite knowledge of capitulation rumors, the report notes. We assume orders to cease hostilities have not reached them. They were right. Back at Reims, Allied officers began to realize that confirmation messages from the northern German commands were missing. By regulation, every German field headquarters that received the ceasefire order was required to send acknowledgement. By the evening of May 8th, acknowledgements had been received from Army Groups South and Centre, but not from Vistula. British and American commanders feared the worst, that the Germans were violating the surrender. General Eisenhower, unwilling to risk a breakdown of Allied unity, ordered that no formal celebration be announced until confirmation came from all fronts. Winston Churchill was furious, wanting to declare victory at once. Eisenhower refused. He knew that the Soviets were watching every movement for signs of deceit. If fighting continued against them while the West celebrated, Joseph Stalin would accuse the Allies of conspiracy of allowing the Germans to surrender selectively. That accusation arrived anyway. Soviet headquarters in Berlin reported continued German resistance on the Baltic front and demanded an immediate second surrender ceremony in their own sector. Stalin insisted that the first signing at Reims was insufficient because his commanders had not been present and because German units had not stopped fighting. It was not an entirely false claim. On the night of May 8th, the missing message finally went out again, this time by courier. A German liaison officer, under a white flag, carried a copy of the Reims surrender order to the 12th Army, near Wismar. He arrived late in the afternoon of May 9th. The officer who received it, General Kurt von Tippelskirch, read the document in silence, then ordered his staff to cease all operations immediately. By then, hundreds of men on both sides were already dead from battles fought after peace had been signed. The message had traveled less than 200 miles. It had taken nearly 2 days to do it. When historians later reconstructed the timeline from Allied and German archives, they found the trail of that message, like the ghost of the war itself, a path marked by broken trucks, failed generators, jammed radios, and human exhaustion. It was not betrayal that delayed the end. It was entropy. In a war defined by mechanized destruction, the final act had been undone by something entirely human, the limits of communication in a world too shattered to hear itself. The war in Europe was officially over, but for 48 hours it continued to fight on through static and silence. The surrender was done, the ink dry, the news broadcast across the free world, but in the ruins of northern Germany, the war still breathed. It was May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. London's streets were alive with flags and church bells, Paris filled with singing crowds. New York woke to headlines that declared, "It's over." Yet, on the cold fields between Schwerin and Wismar, the sound that ruled the morning was still gunfire. The men of Army Group Vistula had not received their orders. Their commanders General Kurt, Student, and General von Tippelskirch were clinging to broken telephones and fading radios, waiting for confirmation that never came. To them, the world beyond their trenches was rumor and distortion. They knew something was happening. Prisoners spoke of surrender. Leaflets dropped from Allied planes announced that hostilities shall cease tonight, but until the order came through official channels, no one dared to lay down arms. In the German army, disobedience still carried the memory of a firing squad. By dawn, the Soviets were advancing again. Marshal Rokossovsky's tank armies rolled through the mist, cutting through the remnants of the German line. The thunder of artillery echoed through the lowlands, shaking barns and churches that had somehow survived 6 years of war. Soviet aircraft strafed convoys of refugees fleeing west. They were no longer soldiers, women, children, and old men pulling carts with ropes across their shoulders. The Germans had told them the British would be merciful. They only had to reach the Elbe. For most, that was an illusion measured in corpses. At Reims, SHAEF's signal room was still attempting to confirm the last acknowledgements. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Riley, one of the senior communications officers, later recalled in his debriefing that Army Group Vistula was a blank space on the board, no receipt, no denial, just silence. By mid-morning, Eisenhower himself had been informed. He refused to issue any public statement of victory until every front confirmed cessation of hostilities. Churchill pressed for immediate announcement. The crowds in London were already celebrating, but Eisenhower was adamant. "If men are still dying, there is no peace," he said. In the field, men were dying by the hundreds. German batteries near Rostock opened fire on advancing Soviet infantry at 6 o'clock in the morning. The Red Army returned fire with Katyusha rockets, setting entire villages ablaze. The battle continued through the morning and into the afternoon. When Soviet loudspeakers announced in German that the war was over, most soldiers thought it was a trick. They used loudspeakers before, one captured officer later told Allied interrogators. They said things to break our morale. We thought this was the same. By noon, Berlin was quiet under Soviet occupation, but 150 miles northwest, the front still burned. The 12th Army tried to fight its way west toward the British lines, unaware that the British had already halted combat operations at 11:01 the previous night. When the German column approached the British perimeter near Lübeck, it was met not by gunfire but by bewildered silence. British troops watched as entire battalions, filthy and starving, marched toward them, waving makeshift white flags. But farther east, where the Soviets advanced, no such surrender occurred. In Moscow, the Kremlin received reports that the NMREC Germans were still resisting in the north. Stalin, furious, called the Reims surrender a Western charade and demanded a second, formal signing before the Soviet command. Orders went out for every front to continue operations until an official ceremony in Berlin could be held. The Red Army was to make no assumptions of peace until the last German command personally surrendered to the Soviets. Thus, while the world celebrated, the war reignited across the Baltic coast. In the town of Demmin, civilians trapped between Soviet and German lines faced a nightmare. German officers refused to surrender without orders, and Soviet artillery shells began falling across the River Peene. Panic spread through the town. In the next 48 hours, hundreds of civilians took their own lives, some drowning in the river, others hanging themselves from rafters or taking poison. Survivors later testified that German propaganda had convinced them the Soviets would commit unspeakable atrocities. "We believed the war could not end this way," one woman recalled in 1946. "No one told us it already had." That same night, on May 8th, radio operators at Flensburg finally re-established power and began transmitting the Reims order again. But Soviet jamming made the signal unreadable across most of northern Germany. The operators increased wattage, burning out 2 transmitters in the process. Only fragments of the message were received. In one intercepted burst, Allied translators later reconstructed the phrase, "cease operations at 23:01 hours," but the call sign and authentication code were missing. To the German units that heard it, the message could have been a hoax. In the ruins of a farmhouse outside Schwerin, General von Tippelskirch met with his senior staff. His adjutant recorded the moment in a post-war affidavit. The general said, "We have heard of surrender, but we have no order. To surrender without order is desertion. To continue is madness." No one answered. They continued fighting until the morning of May 9th, when a courier arrived under a white flag carrying a typed document, the missing order, stamped with the seal of the German High Command. At 11 o'clock that morning, von Tippelskirch gave the command to cease fire. The last artillery pieces of Army Group Vistula fell silent. The Soviets advanced cautiously, expecting a trap, until they saw German soldiers stacking their rifles and stepping away. By then, thousands were dead men who, by every measure of law, had already been defeated. The message had been delayed by 48 hours. The war had been over, yet it still managed to claim one more toll of human life. In London, Churchill's victory speech echoed across the empire. In Moscow, Stalin declared May 9th the official end of the Great Patriotic War. But in the German countryside, the survivors of Army Group Vistula were herded into captivity, their faces blank, from exhaustion. A British officer who visited the area days later wrote, "They looked like men walking after their own funerals. They did not know the date, only that the noise had stopped." When historians later examined the sequence of transmissions, they found no villain, no plot, only the fragility of communication in a shattered continent, a generator that failed, a courier delayed, a signal jammed by weather and interference. Each small failure added up to a tragedy measured in days and lives. For the men who fought in those last battles, the war did not end in triumph or surrender, but in confusion. They had outlived the empire they served, and died obeying orders that no longer existed. 2 days after peace had been signed, the guns finally went quiet. Europe exhaled. The lost message had arrived. When the last guns of Army Group Vistula fell silent on May 9th, 1945, the air itself seemed to hesitate. For the men who had survived those final 48 hours, peace did not come as a roar of celebration, but as a hollow absence, the first true silence they had heard in years. The smoke still hung low over the Baltic fields. Cows wandered untended through wrecked villages. The only sounds were the ticking of cooling engines and the coughing of the wounded. General von Tippelskirch's staff stood beside a ditch filled with spent shells and broken rifles, while Soviet officers approached under a white flag. No one saluted. No one spoke. The war had been too long, too heavy for ceremony. The Soviets, grim and mud-streaked, accepted the surrender wordlessly, collecting pistols and field maps. Behind them rolled trucks bearing Red Army photographers who began documenting what they called the last battlefield in Europe. Those photographs, now stored in the archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, show men who look more like survivors of a natural disaster than of an army. Back in Flensburg, Admiral Karl Dönitz received confirmation that all fronts had ceased fighting. It was shortly after noon. His adjutant wrote, "The Admiral said nothing for a full minute. Then he exhaled and whispered, 'It is finished.' For his exhausted government, no longer a government at all, there was relief and despair in equal measure. Dönitz ordered a final radio broadcast to the German people. The transmission went out that evening, the voice of a naval officer speaking words that reached few working radios. German men and women, the struggle has ended. The sacrifice has been immense. May God grant us a new beginning." The Allied signal officers at Reims logged the last confirmations into the SHAEF communications ledger at 1700 hours on May 9th. Every army group, every corps, every isolated garrison had acknowledged receipt. Lieutenant Colonel Riley underlined the final entry and wrote across the page, "No further hostile messages received." The war in Europe was, at last, a completed circuit. But history does not turn off as neatly as a radio. Across the continent, men who had fought through 6 winters of annihilation now faced the weight of survival. Some tried to convince themselves they were lucky, others felt only guilt. In makeshift camps near Lübeck, captured German soldiers sat beside Soviet guards, sharing cigarettes in silence. A British correspondent who witnessed the scene wrote, "They stared at the ground as if the soil itself might give them an explanation." In the small towns of Mecklenburg, the news of surrender arrived almost as rumour. Peasants emerging from cellars asked the same question again and again. Is it true? No one knew how to answer. For many, the proof was visual, the sight of Soviets and Germans standing together without firing, the sound of engines idling instead of advancing. In Wismar, a Lutheran pastor rang his church bell for the first time in months. People gathered in the square, uncertain whether to pray or to weep. The Allied press releases spoke of triumph and liberation. Yet in the diaries, later recovered by the US strategic bombing survey teams, one phrase appears repeatedly among soldiers and civilians alike. Too late. Too late for the prisoners who died on forced marches during those final days. Too late for the families who drowned in the Peene River at Demmin. Too late for the thousands who perished after the signatures were already dry. Victory could not resurrect them. Peace had arrived by arithmetic, not by mercy. The missing message, the one that had taken 2 days to cross 200 miles, became a small entry in the massive files of post-war documentation. It was logged as transmission delay, Army Group Vistula, Reims Directive, May 1945. Nothing more. But to historians of the Air Force Historical Research Agency and the National Archives, that entry remains a symbol of how modern war could be decided by the failure of a single circuit. Armies of millions had fought for 6 years, yet the last deaths occurred because of a generator, a jammed frequency, and exhaustion. When former combatants met decades later at the 1985 Pacific and European Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, a Soviet pilot and a German infantryman from Mecklenburg spoke of those final days. The German said, "We fought ghosts. We did not know we were already dead." The pilot nodded. "We killed ghosts. We did not know they had surrendered." In the end, that is what those 48 hours became, a haunting, a war that had ended everywhere except in the minds of the men still holding rifles, waiting for an order that had already been written. When it finally reached them, carried by a courier on a battered motorcycle, it did not sound like victory. It sounded like release. The message read, "All operations will cease at 11:01 on the night of May 8th, Central European Time. Nothing more, no flourish, no blessing. Just a time, already past, and the command to stop." The soldier who received it folded the paper and placed it in his tunic pocket. Around him, the fields were silent, except for the wind moving through the wreckage. The war was over. The world, at last, could begin again. On the morning of May 10th, 1945, the war in Europe had ended everywhere but in memory. Yet even as the official reports declared complete cessation of hostilities, stray pockets of fighting continued not from disobedience, but from delay. In the forests of Czechoslovakia, a German battalion still traded fire with partisan units, unaware that Berlin had fallen nearly 2 weeks earlier. In Norway, an isolated garrison on a fjord kept its searchlights sweeping across the sky for Allied bombers that would never come. In northern Germany, the British and Soviets finally met at the town of Wismar, the same ground that had echoed with gunfire 48 hours earlier. There, amid fields blackened by shelling, they staged a joint flag-raising, ceremony to mark the final link-up. It was not an act of triumph, but of weary acknowledgement. A Soviet colonel and a British major shook hands for the cameras. Their faces showed no joy, only relief. Both had lost men in the fighting that should never have happened. The British archives record the event in one line. Ceasefire, confirmed in Northern Sector, 1100 hours, May 10th, 1945. Nothing more, no mention of the hundreds who had fallen after the surrender had already been signed. War records are precise but rarely merciful. In the days that followed, investigators from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and the Allied Control Commission began piecing together how the message to Army Group Vistula had gone astray. They interviewed telegraph operators, couriers, and officers at Flensburg. The conclusion, though anticlimactic, was devastatingly simple: human fatigue and equipment failure. The generator outage on May 7th, the delayed courier from Squill, Reims, and Soviet radio interference had combined to create a perfect storm of silence. A sergeant from the German Signal Corps later testified that when the power failed at Flensburg, he tried to hand-crank the transmitter to keep the frequency alive. "We thought we could send enough to be understood," he said, "but the signal was weak, and we were exhausted. We did not know it would cost lives." The transcript of his testimony sits today in the National Archives, marked unclassified, though the weight of it remains. The Allied command never blamed anyone. There was no court-martial, no reprimand. The war had consumed too much already to demand more punishment. Instead, the incident was logged as an operational anomaly, one of many in the chaos of the Third Reich's collapse. Yet among historians of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, that anomaly became a lesson taught for generations. Wars do not end at the signing table. They end when every man who holds a weapon knows it is over. Meanwhile, in the Baltic ports, tens of thousands of German prisoners began their long march into captivity. The Soviets rounded them up in columns that stretched for miles. Many believed they were being taken to processing camps for repatriation. Few realized they were beginning journeys that would end years later in Siberia. Among them were men who had fought through those final 48 hours, still certain that surrender was treachery until the order came. On May 12th, Marshal Rokossovsky reported to Moscow that hostilities in the northern and eastern sectors have entirely ceased. The Kremlin declared the Great Patriotic War officially over. Stalin announced that Germany's final act of resistance had been crushed beneath the boots of the Red Army. He never mentioned that those final battles had been fought not out of defiance, but out of ignorance. In the ruins of Flensburg, Allied officers dismantled what remained of Dönitz's government. On May 23rd, British troops entered his headquarters and placed him under arrest. The Reich, that had once ruled a continent, now existed only as prisoners of war, tattered documents, and wreckage. Yet, on Dönitz's desk, investigators found a single sheet of paper, a carbon copy of the surrender order sent from Reims, its edges burned from a candle. In the margin, someone had written in pencil, "Delivered too late." That phrase would outlive the men who wrote it. In the decades after, at reunions and memorials, veterans from both sides spoke of those 2 extra days with a kind of quiet shame. They did not speak of heroism or duty, only of futility, the sense that they had been trapped in a war that had already ended. At the 1962 U.S. Japanese Aviation History Symposium, an American historian summarized it best while discussing another theater of war. In the end, men do not die for victory. They die because a message does not arrive. And so, history closed the European chapter of the Second World War with a whisper rather than an explosion, a signature, a generator failure, and 48 more hours of killing. When the last surrender was recorded and the last message acknowledged, there was no celebration at Reims, no bands or parades. There was only the sound of paper being filed into a cabinet and the clicking shut of the drawer. Somewhere in the countryside near Wismar, a farmer's child found a folded slip of paper half buried in the mud. It bore the words that should have stopped the fighting 2 days earlier. "All operations will cease at 11:01 on the night of May 8th, Central European Time." The child could not read it. He took it home, thinking it was a page from a school book. For the world, it was the most expensive delay in history, the silence between message sent and message received. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, the battle shifted from fields and skies to the purtic, quiet bureaucracy of occupation. The Allied armies turned from fighting to counting prisoners, counting dead, counting missing. Yet amid the ledgers and reports, one line kept reappearing in the communications logs. Message delayed Northern Front, May 7th to 9th. What had been a momentary lapse in transmission now became a matter of study, debate, and uneasy fascination. How could a war that mobilized millions and spanned continents hinge on the failure of a single order to arrive? At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, clerks pored over teletype records, tracing every signal that had left Reims in the early hours of May 7, 1945. The order to cease hostilities, originally transmitted under the designation Operational Directive 2315Z, showed successful relay to nearly every German command. Only one entry, the one routed to Army Group Vistula, was marked "No confirmation received." The British communications officer in the charge of that relay, Major Leonard Beecham, submitted a post-action memorandum that read simply, "Transmission interrupted at 05:27 hours. Power failure at Flensburg Station confirmed." It was a bureaucratic understatement for a tragedy that had cost more lives than many full-scale battles in the final week of the war. The message's delay soon became the subject of quiet friction between the Allies. The Soviets accused SHAEF of permitting continued resistance in the north to allow German troops to flee west. Western officials countered that Soviet jamming and poor atmospheric conditions had blocked transmission. Neither accusation was entirely false. Both were true enough to sustain decades of suspicion. In later Soviet archives, recently examined by historians, one report by Marshal Rokossovsky complains, "Enemy communications continue unimpeded with British forces, even after Reims' declaration. Our signals cannot penetrate their interference." In reality, there was no conspiracy, only the chaos of a dying regime and the imperfections of human machinery. At Flensburg, Allied investigators interviewed the last surviving members of Dönitz's staff. One of them, Lieutenant Hans Blum, had been on duty in the signal office when the Reims order arrived. His statement, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, reads, "We received an English transmission early on the morning of the 7th, decoded it with difficulty, and prepared acknowledgement. Before we could send, the generator stopped. We switched to battery power, but lost range. The message was repeated later, partially. We did not know if it was received. I remember the room being filled with candle smoke. That candle smoke, the mark of exhausted men trying to light their dying equipment, was the last flicker of a nation's command structure. In London and Washington, news of the delay reached high levels but was quietly contained. Victory had to be total, clean, and undivided. No one wished to tell the public that men were still dying 2 days after peace had been declared. Official communiques simply noted sporadic engagements in northern Germany. Newspapers carried photographs of Churchill waving from a balcony, Eisenhower smiling at Reims, and Stalin toasting in Moscow. No mention was made of the nameless infantry still buried in the mud near Schwerin, or of the couriers who rode through gunfire to deliver a message of peace. Within weeks, those final deaths had become footnotes. Historians call this process archival mercy, the way paperwork smooths the jagged edges of human error. Reports were standardized, signatures collected, and the war translated into numbers. Yet some Allied officers refused to forget. Colonel Riley, the SHAEF signal officer who had tracked the missing acknowledgement, wrote a private letter to his wife that June. "It seems obscene to celebrate perfection when the last shots were fired, because a radio died. We have learned to make war faster than we can send peace." In the ruins of Wismar, villagers began burying the dead from both sides in shared graves. Wooden crosses bore dates that mocked the official record, May 8th, May 9th. For the people of that region, those days would never be VE Day. They would be remembered as Die verlorenen Tage, the lost days. Years later, when scholars from the U.S. National Archives compiled the final operations of the European theatre, they restored those missing hours to the historical timeline. The war, they concluded, did not end at Reims or even at Berlin. It ended in a farmer's field on the Baltic coast when a messenger, his motorcycle splattered with mud, handed a crumpled document to a general who could no longer remember why anyone was still fighting. That is how modern wars end, not with parades or trumpets, but with paper arriving late. By late summer of 1945, the guns had long gone silent, Yet the ripples of that delayed transmission continued to spread through the fragile calm of occupied Germany. For military historians, it became a mystery wrapped in static, a case study in how a single disruption could stretch the life of a global conflict by 2 whole days. For the men who had fought through those final hours, it became something else entirely, proof that even peace required power, precision, and luck. In September, the Allied Communications Board convened in London to compile its post-action technical report on ceasefire transmission protocols. The committee gathered field logs, teletype rolls, and decoded message strips from every sector. Among them was the original Reims directive, the one bearing Eisenhower's authorization and the SHAEF timestamp, 0230 hours, May 7th. The message was crisp, direct, and mercilessly clear. All German forces will cease offensive operations at 1 minute past 11 p.m. Central European Time, May 8th, A. British signal specialist named Wing Commander Alistair Grant presented the committee's findings. "Gentlemen," he began, "we have confirmed that this order reached every major command except one. Army Group Vistula's confirmation was logged 47 hours, 53 minutes after transmission." He paused before adding, "That is the longest gap in the chain of command ever recorded during modern warfare." The explanation, they concluded, lay in the simplest of failures, a blackout. When the auxiliary generator at Flensburg burned out, the last functioning transmitter capable of receiving Allied frequencies went dead. The message had to be physically couriered, a 200-mile journey across roads clogged with refugees, wreckage, and advancing Soviet units. The courier, a Wehrmacht signals officer named Feldwebel Ernst Heller, later told U.S. investigators that he rode through the night on a motorcycle scavenged from a supply depot, carrying the document in his tunic. The sound of the engine, he said, was the only thing louder than the silence of the front. Heller never made it to his original destination. Soviet patrols near Schwerin forced him to detour west, eventually delivering the order on May 9th. His name appears once in the SHAEF follow-up report and then vanishes from history. He lived, according to post-war records, until 1983, a retired mechanic in Bremen who seldom spoke of the war except to say, "I once carried a piece of paper that stopped it." The lost message became an object of fascination among post-war scholars. In 1962, at the U.S. Japanese Aviation History Symposium, an American colonel referenced it as the perfect symbol of the 20th century, a world where technology could end empires but not deliver a letter on time. At that same conference, a German historian stood and replied, "Perhaps it was fitting." Germany began the war with perfect coordination and ended it with a broken wire. The audience laughed, but quietly. The irony was too sharp. In the decades that followed, the story resurfaced whenever communication failures shaped history during the Berlin airlift, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even the early space program. Each time, someone would mention the message that arrived 2 days late and the men who died waiting for it. At the Air Force Historical Research Agency, the incident became part of officer training. A plaque in the communications wing still bears the inscription, "Peace depends on transmission." Meanwhile, survivors in northern Germany marked those 48 hours with their own ritual. Each May 9th, in the town of Wismar, veterans of both armies gathered beside the small memorial that overlooked the fields where they had once fought. They would stand in silence for exactly 2 minutes, one for each day lost, before laying flowers at the base of a stone etched with the words, "Friede zu spät," peace too late. The tradition lasted until the last of them was gone. By 1985, at the Pacific and European Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, the story had become legend. A Soviet officer who had been stationed near the Baltic in those final days met an American radio technician from SHAEF. Over glasses of whiskey, they compared notes. "We thought you were still attacking," the Soviet said. The American shook his head. "We thought you already knew." Both men laughed, and then fell silent, the laughter echoing the uneasy humor of survivors who understood that history's tragedies often begin with something as small as a broken circuit. In the archives of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, the Reims surrender order rests in a temperature-controlled case. Its paper has yellowed, but the ink remains sharp. Next to it, under glass, lies a smaller document, the duplicate that finally reached Army Group Vistula. The difference between the two is only the date, one stamped May 7th, the other May 9th, yet between those two sheets lies 48 hours, hundreds of lives, and the last echo of the Second World War. Time, it seems, can be measured not only in minutes and hours, but in the silence between messages. And so the war that ended on paper at 2:30 in the morning of May 7th truly ended only when a single courier, riding through rain and ruins, placed a folded sheet on a general's desk 2 days later. The greatest conflict in human history did not finish with a battle or a speech, but with the quiet arrival of a message long delayed, a reminder that even victory must wait for transmission.